So, firstly now, I'd like to look at who's the child in the text. What's the imaginary of the policymakers? And how are the child's best interests secured? Following Wyness, is the child constructed as innocent, dependent upon adults, and as essentially an undeveloped, and as Melanie talked yesterday, an asexual adult, or as an agentic individual enmeshed in a range of social relations and networks that impact upon identities and choices, including rights in sports participation? As just mentioned, the rights shall protect every child as an individual, and the guidelines state clearly, children are children and not small adults. Yet this liberationist idea of children as a rights holder, irrespective of age, remains undeveloped, and children are more frequently constructed as unfinished adults, especially because children's sports are repeatedly constructed in binary opposition to adult sports. Indeed, children are most often defined as dependent upon adults, parents, coaches, or club officials. The discourses vary, though, from a middle way position that acknowledges children's rights in and through ongoing generational relations to a more conservative perspective, constructing children as incompetents. For example, up until the age of 6 years, children should be accompanied by an adult in training. In paragraph 7, entitled On the Children's Terms, sports clubs and groups, it states, must work together to offer children a diverse range of sporting activities that are suitable for their age, physical development, and level of maturity. In paragraph 4, entitled Influence, children have the right to express their own opinions and have them considered. They should have the opportunity to participate in the planning and the implementation of their sporting activities together with their coaches and parents. And I think that links up to the data that Karen was sharing and to what degree that actually takes place. It's important to highlight, though, that how these different rights should be achieved is nigh on absent in the texts. Continuing analysis of the imagined child, with regard to learning, I've identified two main discourses. There are some traces of the idea that children are tabula rasa, the empty slate that Melanie talked about yesterday, who need to be encouraged to learn new things and have a right to experience mastery and learn many different skills, experience variation, practice, and teamwork. But learning and children are dominantly constructed within biobehavioral discourses of development. Psychological theories about predictable, progressive stages in mental development inspired by Piaget, and physiological and anatomical discourses about physical maturation dominate. There's very little evidence of ideas that construct learning as a situated sociocultural practice in which children are active agents, like the project yesterday Lotte and Jeppe presented. Now, the so-called development plan, which is, as I say, a part of the children's rights, proffers 3 developmental stages, up to 6 years, 7 to 9 years, and 10 to 12 years. And these are regulations that sports federations and coaches are expected to heed. Its emphasis is on the development of physical motor skills, initially to strengthen basic movement skills through play, but then provide a variety of activities, but from 10 years upwards, introduce specialization in one or more sports to ensure a strong technical foundation. So here we can trace sports' premise of talent development rather than discourses that celebrate, for example, educating individuals to assume their right to choose or empowering them to resist oppression or abuse. I think that paragraph 5, freedom to choose, offers us a glimpse of a more agentic child, when it states that children have the right to choose which sport or how many sports they wish to participate in, as well as the right to determine how much they wish to practice their own sport. Yet, as I said, this is undermined by any lack of reference to how this might be achieved. And we know that many sports clubs actually only offer one sport. In contrast, the document Guidelines for Youth Sport positions children/youth as more or less independent actors. The comfort of the feather pillows has affected my voice here, sorry about that. There's merely one reference to parents who, alongside coaches and club leaders, must follow up the implementation of the guidelines in practice and ensure a safe, varied and inclusive sports arena. Interestingly, there's no reference to safeguarding or to NIF's guidelines to prevent sexual harassment and abuse in sports, similar to their absence in the children's rights guidelines. And most of the text is concerned with the organisation of competition. The text also highlights that 15-year-olds have the right to vote within NIF's organisation on par with adults and are, by definition, therefore, adult-like. The youth guidelines that comprise of 2 pages devotes an entire page to children's rights to coach and leadership education. And I quote, "Courses must provide increased competency and engagement amongst youth so that participation, either as an athlete, referee, coach, or committee member, is the best possible." Now, while it's commendable to offer courses to youth, there's a significant shift away from children's rights in sports and as athletic participants in the direction of youth as assuming key roles in the organisation of sports, particularly that of coaches and referees. So following my colleague Strittmatter, the discourses, I think, can be linked to increasing dropout rates that threaten NIF's legitimacy as a major player in the provision of children's sports, for which they receive considerable public monies. I believe NIF's idiosyncratic definition of who's a child or no longer a child, compared to the UN's definition, is another indicator of them using children's rights to serve the organisations as opposed to youth's need. And Inge's presentation yesterday showed us all too clearly how youth referees are particularly still in need of protection and need to be active participants. There's little recognition of children as being interwoven with social and economic structures or as agentic individuals. In 2007, children were depicted as socially interchangeable. A child is a child. An acknowledgement of social differences is found in the 2015 text, but only in the form of images representing the variables of gender, disability, and ethnicity. The written text, though, continued to promote the notion of a universal child. In 2019, the amended set of rights does actually include written reference to children's varying social backgrounds and the potential for these to provide grounds for discrimination. But in this document, the photographic illustrations compete with this image of plurality to predominantly, as it's illustrated here on the left, promote a white, able-bodied child, with the exception of one image of a young girl with Down syndrome. And as we noticed yesterday, that was NIF's official picture. The idea of the interchangeable universal child is reinforced by the provision of an adult who holds responsibility for children's sports, including ensuring sound procedures for giving coaches, volunteers, and parents information regarding these rights and provisions. And everyone in the club supports the rights, makes sure they endeavour to offer varied activities, and include all children. There are few requirements concerning the qualifications for this role, and emphasis is, as it says on the slide, on administration rather than education. The only formal requirement is a certificate of good conduct from the police, although anyone assuming the role can take a non-compulsory e-learning module entitled Core Values in Children's Sport that basically outlines the guidelines. Hence, the potential complexities of how to include all children in sports activities are written out of the text. Again, with regard to what's not in the text, there are no traces of any minimum requirements for the qualifications required to be able to coach children. Raising awareness or providing information, let alone education, to children as opposed to their parents or coaches is not even mentioned. The provisions on children's sports that are integral to children's rights are saturated by discourses of sport, as we'd probably expect, in particular competition. They aim to regulate competitions, as I said, about time, about travelling, the cost of travel, and in keeping with the idea of children's developmental stages, participation in regional competitions is deemed suitable from age 9 upwards. We heard this again from Christina yesterday. Whereas competition in the Nordic countries and the Barents region can commence at 11 years. Rankings and result lists are prohibited for children below the age of 11 years, and all children must receive a prize if prizes are awarded. Significantly, the seeming equity for all children is shattered by the possibility for exemptions. Some children do not require as much protection as others if they're deemed to be talented. A sports federation, as opposed to the child or their parents, can apply to NIF for such permission. Once again, I would argue the child is written out of the text. Following the Foucauldian notion that it's equally important to analyse what's not in the text, I'll round off the presentation by, again, bringing your attention to the absence of any substantial focus upon what is meant by safeguarding. Though children are constructed as potentially vulnerable and innocent, in need of an environment that is safe and secure, without pressure or exploitation, none of these terms are explained in any depth. As already mentioned, NIF's policy on the prevention of sexual harassment and abuse is omitted from the guidelines, and there's no mention of emotional abuse as described by Inge yesterday. So in effect, the text can be interpreted as constructing sport as an arena free for sexual harassment or abuse, which in turn does not offer potential child victims or adults acting in loco parentis, any language for dealing with cases of exploitation. I'd argue that this omission does discursive work to uphold the idea that sport is a good place to be. I reiterate, no discourse is singularly good or bad. Yet I will contend that the dominance of discourses associated with the regulation of competition and talent development in the guidelines on children's and youth's rights in sport, and the imaginary of the child as being partially or wholly dependent upon adults, can be understood to serve the logic of sports associations to a greater degree than serving the needs and the rights of children. Thank you for listening.